The year is 1069. 3 years earlier, Duke William of Normandy defeated Harold Godwin at the Battle of Hastings, bringing an end to Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Of course, the Anglo-Saxon world wasn't going to take this lying down, and King William of England, as he is now, needed to assert his control, particularly in the rebellious north. He did this by sending out groups of knights on horseback. Their mission was to slaughter the local residents of places like this, which is Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire. He was to cause so much destruction to the land that it could no longer sustain life. A group of knights that were sent out to terrorise the land you see right behind me now returned back to camp, fewer in number, visibly shaken and carrying a paralysed soldier. They regaled King William with a tale of terror as one of their soldiers had been turned into a hideous monster. Hello and welcome to Step Through History. To find out about King William's men here at the Church of St John and a little bit more about the monster in the Minster, we're going to have to go back to the 8th and 9th century. This is a cracking tale that runs from Athelstan to William the Conqueror, from the formation of England to the harrying of the North. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, please like, please subscribe, and it'd be lovely to hear from you if you want to leave a comment. Right, enjoy.
We begin our story in the 9th century at the Church of St John in the Kingdom of Northumbria. According to the Lurk Lane excavations of 79 to 82, a substantial Saxon site is present, though some of it extends beneath the current minster, so has not been entirely studied. The old church was surrounded by a ditch and rampart. An internal bank of clay extending from the ditch was topped with either a timber palisade or a hawthorn hedge. Overall, the defensive structures measured around 4.5 metres wide and between 4 to 5 metres tall, useful for keeping out wild animals or unwanted visitors, useless against any sustained attack.
By the year 851, the church was abandoned and a coin hoard was left buried on site for protection, but never reclaimed. It could be that the inhabitants were killed, or they dispersed and couldn't or wouldn't return. All we do know is it was the first year the Norsemen decided to overwinter. The church was once again abandoned in 866, the year the great heathen army sailed up the Humber.
By the year 870, the ditches were overgrown, the walls were crumbling, and the marauding Northmen who had utterly impoverished this area had moved further south in search of more wealth. Monks, clergy and nuns, they did return to Beverley and the land of St John to restore the religious buildings so they are fit for divine worship, but it is said that in this state of insecurity and comparative uselessness, it remained.
There are two salient points to take from this so far. The arrival of the Norsemen would take Northumbria into a new era. The Anglo-Danish culture that emerged is the source of pride every northerner has for their accent, dialect, place names and traditions. There was, and is, a dividing line between the north and south of England, and it wasn't simply Watling Street. The divide was cultural, political and linguistic. Northumbria would look to Scandinavia, whereas Wessex would look to the Franks in continental Europe. If we quickly rush forward to the Norman invasion, it's clear that William was not invading a homogeneous land and people, as we will discover. England and the English were far off becoming concrete and definable. Which brings us to our next point. England is not yet a country. By the end of the 9th century, we have the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. The Danelaw consisted of the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, as well as what is referred to as the Five Boroughs, made up of Stamford, Nottingham, Leicester, Lindsey and Derby. Alfred the Great was not King of England. He was King of the West Saxons, and in time overlord of half of Mercia, the other half being under Scandinavian control. Nor was his son Edward ever King of England. Along with his sister, Ethelfled of Mercia, he wrestled back control of Mercia, conquered the Five Boroughs, and accepted the submission of the Kingdom of East Anglia. Only Northumbria remained outside the West Saxon fold. I use the word conquer and not reclaim, as Alfred's dynasty had no claim on the land outside of Wessex. It might be that their aim was not to rule over a predetermined area that they had earmarked as the extent of the Kingdom of England. They envisioned a kingdom of all the Angles and Saxons. This could be a clever and calculated strategy. If you have no claim on the land, claim the people, and the land will follow. Edward's son, Athelstan, would be the one to finally unite, and I use that term loosely, all the kingdoms of the Angles and Saxons. Not everyone considers him the first king of England, but I'll lay my cards out on the table. I'm a huge fan of Athelstan, so I'm happy for him to take the title. By the time Athelstan ascended the throne in 920, Sitric, King of Dublin and Jorvik, the grandson of the notorious Ivar the Boneless, controlled the land formerly known as Deira. North of Sitric's kingdom lies Bernicia, centred around Bamborough, or Bebenber, the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom to remain independent from West Saxon and Scandinavian control throughout this period in history. To further complicate the landscape of the north, we must also consider the Kingdom of Strathclyde. This stretched from southern Scotland to modern-day Cumbria and Westmorland. Considered a Brythonic culture, speaking a form of Old Welsh, there is evidence of a limited number of Anglo-Saxon settlements. Not only that, but the mountains of the Lake District in Cumbria attracted Norse settlers from modern-day Norway. No doubt it reminded them of home, though with a more comfortable climate. The Old Norse language was still in use in these parts well into the 12th century.
Currently, we are 146 years prior to the Norman conquest, and the idea that there is a neatly packaged, clearly defined kingdom and people for William to conquer seems, to quote Malcolm Tucker, neither foreseeable nor unforeseeable. In the year 924, Alfred the Great's son, Edward the Elder, has died, and his kingdom is split up. Athelstan, his son, gained the kingdom of Mercia, and a very short time later, the kingdom of Wessex, after his half-brother Elfweard died just a few weeks after his father. The circumstances around the quick changes are debatable, but all that matters for this story is Wessex and Mercia were under the control of one person, Athelstan.
Athelstan clearly had his eyes on the kingdom of Jorvik. He would at first at least try to find a diplomatic way through this problem. He married his sister to Sitric, known as the Squinty, to form an alliance. Some sources state that this was a non-aggression pact, with a promise to help each other out in time of war. Other sources believe an agreement was reached, in which upon the death of Sitric, the kingdom of Jorvik would transfer to Athelstan. Whatever was agreed, shortly after the marriage in 927, Sitric died, and Athelstan moved quickly to claim the throne of Jorvik. This act wouldn't go unchallenged. Relatives of Sitric, based in Ireland, would raise an army to win back what they saw as their rightful inheritance. One of the claimants, named Godfred, was at the court of Constantine II, King of Scotland. No doubt asking the Scots for military support against the advancing and ever more powerful unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom. I doubt persuasion would have been too difficult. All rulers at this time would be keenly and nervously watching Athelstan's moves. There was a benefit in it for Constantine, too. A restored independent kingdom of Jorvik would provide a buffer zone between his kingdom and that of Athelstan's. Athelstan demanded that Constantine handed over the fugitive Godfred. Constantine refused, and when his diplomatic efforts began to fail, Athelstan resorted to his military might, marching on Scotland to punish their king. On his march north near Lincoln, he came across a company of pilgrims, singing and rejoicing. Athelstan inquired as to where they had been and why they are so elated. The pilgrims stated that they had come from Beverley, where by the merits and intercession of the glorious confessor, John, the blind, lame and deaf and other infirm persons were restored to health. Athelstan's army moved northwestwards to York, whilst Athelstan himself took a detour across the Humber to visit the sepulchre of the confessor John. When there, he prostrated himself before the relics and devoutly prayed for his protection and assistance. Drawing his knife from its scabbard, he placed it on the high altar of the Church of St. John and pledged that if he succeeds and returns alive to claim it, he shall honour the church and increase its possessions. The churchman suggested that Athelstan take a token to show that he visited the sacred spot. When he arrived in York to link back up with his army, the banner of St. John was proudly on display. It wouldn't be the last time the banner was waved at the head of an army marching to war. From York they marched north, making camp by a river crossing on the Scottish borders the night before they were due to confront their enemy. Whilst alone in his tent that evening, a certain form, clothed in a pontifical habit, stood before him. The figure desired the king to prepare his army to pass the river in the morning in face of their opponents. Athelstan asked as to who this figure was. The figure replied with the name John. "Pass then fearlessly with your army, for you shall conquer. For this purpose I have come to speak with you." The message was relayed to the troops, spurring the army of the Angles and the Saxons on to ravage the land up to Aberdeen, whilst the fleet caused mayhem and destruction right up to Caithness.
Upon returning from a successful campaign against Constantine, Athelstan once again returned to Beverley and the Church of St. John. He had a knife to claim and a promise to keep.
Athelstan established a college of secular canons and endowed it generously with land and privileges. One of the privileges was the creation of a sanctuary, which extended for 2 miles around the tomb of St. John. The limits of sanctuary were marked out by a ring of 4 stones, placed at Leconfield Park, North Burton, Kinwell Graves, and one location is unknown to us, but it's believed to be south of Beverley, near what was the Humber Ferry crossing.
I've come to Killingwold's Graves. It's about 2 miles outside of Beverley. Killingwold's Graves is a great name. I'm sure there's a good story behind it, and I don't know what it is. So if you do, please leave a comment and let me know. That would be really great. But I'm looking for one of the 3 remaining sanctuary stones. Now, they don't look like crosses anymore. They're just more like monoliths. They've decayed over time. But here it is. This is the Killingwold's Graves sanctuary stone. And on the front, I've noticed, but I have no idea what it says. There are some good markings. But quite honestly, I can't work that out. I'd love to know. The privilege of sanctuary was granted to the perpetrator of any crime for 30 nights, providing they fled to the church. This gave them time to admit their guilt or prepare a defence. The idea behind this was that they wouldn't rashly put the accused to death in some petty vendetta, but instead be brought to justice through an impartial trial by the law of the land. To strengthen the rule of law, anyone found violating the sanctuary by inflicting bonds or blows or strikes on the refugee was compelled to pay a high price to the officiating minister of the church. Please remember this fact. It is crucial to the story.
Within the sanctuary church there was, and in Beverley still is, a frith stool with an inscription stating, "This stone chair is called Freed Stool, or Chair of Peace, to which what criminal soever flies hath full protection." The individual claiming sanctuary would sit on the frith stool and with one hand on the Bible swear an oath.
"Sir, take heed on your oath. Ye shall be true and faithful to my Lord Archbishop of York, Lord of this town. Also ye shall bear good heart to the bailey and the governors of this town. Also ye shall bear no pointed weapon, dagger, knife, nay, none other weapon against the king's peace. Also ye shall be ready at all your power, if there be any debate or strife or sudden case of fire within the town, to help seize it. Also ye shall be ready at the obite of King Athelstan, at the warning of the bellman of the town, and do your duty in ringing."
After the oath, they will be required to kiss the book. And I'd like to thank the wonderful voice of Alfred One Take Williams there. That was marvellous. Athelstan's gift helped to rejuvenate the area around Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire. This new college of secular canons had new buildings with evidence of glaziers' workshops and lead works using industrial hearths used to create buildings out of stone and not wood. By 1050, the archbishop added a high stone tower and levelled the ditches and other possibly defensive structures for new construction projects. The investment and development of the area at the start of the 11th century would have only been possible through peace and stability. Minsters are quite common in the Diocese of York, but what is a minster exactly? The word minster is derived from monasterium and housed monks, priests and nuns living a communal life. The minster would act as a sort of mother parish to the smaller religious establishments in the area. One of the most defining features of a minster was in its management. During the earlier Northumbrian Golden Age of the 7th century, Northumbria built its religious base and culture with the help of Irish monks of Iona, and not of those under the Church of Rome. Unlike the continental model, which would see a single figurehead, a bishop or archbishop, running the show, a minster was based on a Celtic model, in which the establishment was managed by 7 canons or culdees. Unlike the bishops of the continental model, the culdees had no separate authority, land or income to the church. To see the advantages of this Celtic model, we need to look no further than the tyrannical Bishop of Durham. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He will come to the story later on. Beverley is first recorded as a minster in Edward the Confessor's Charter of 1061-65, which speaks of Sancta Johannes Minster and Minster life. Anyway, let's get back to Athelstan, first king of all England. Asterisk. But don't let his flashy self-declared titles like Rex Totius Britannia or King of all Britons blindside you. On Athelstan's death in 939, we have 127 years to go before the Battle of Hastings, and the idea of a clearly defined kingdom is still some way off, as we will discover, as we now do a whistle-stop tour of the next century. Following Athelstan's reign, his half-brother Edmund ascended the throne and had to reassert the crown's authority over Northumbria, which was under the control of Sitric's son, Olaf, King of Dublin. Furthermore, Edmund, whose reign, which lasted between 940 and 946, had his army ravage the land of Cumbria, seizing it from the kingdom of Strathclyde. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Edmund let it all to Malcolm, King of the Scots, on the condition that he became his ally, both by sea and land. Clearly Cumbria, back then, was seen as neither English nor of England. Athelstan's other half-brother, Edred, ascended to the throne in 946. At first, the Northumbrians acknowledged the rule of the West Saxon before proclaiming Eric Bloodaxe, son of the Norwegian ruler Harold Fairhair, king in 947. In 948, Edred punished the Northumbrians by ravaging the land, bringing them back to the West Saxon fold once more. This lasted until 949, when the Northumbrians looked to the Norse once more, in the form of Olaf Sitricsson, King of Dublin. Olaf lasted just 3 years, before being overthrown in favour of Eric Bloodaxe. Again, this really reminds me of that phrase, when someone shows you who they are the first time, believe them. Eric lasted just 2 more years, when in 954 he was expelled, and then killed at Stainmore. That might be the end of the line for the Norse rulers of Northumbria, but it is clear through their actions and allegiances where the hearts of the Northumbrians lay. Despite that fact, the Northumbrians resumed their allegiance to Edred once more. Around a decade later, in 959, Edgar ascends to the throne as King of the English, receiving the kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia and Northumbria. And what does that say about the Kingdom of England right now? Moving forward again to the end of the reign of Ethelred the Unready, and things become even more uncertain. In the years leading up to 1013, Ethelred had been ineffective in dealing with the constant invasions, pillaging and plundering of Svein Forkbeard, son of the King of Denmark, Harold Bluetooth. So much so, the disillusioned Anglo-Saxon nobles reluctantly declared Svein Forkbeard king. Ethelred fled into exile, ending up in Normandy. Of course, the Northumbrians immediately accepted Svein as their first Norse king of England. The English, let's not get bogged down in that right now. Svein died around 5 weeks later, and the Anglo-Saxon nobles invite Ethelred back from exile in Normandy, as long as he promised to rule more justly. I'm inclined once more to point out that phrase, when someone shows you who they are the first time, believe them. Just 1 year later, in 1015, Svein's son Canute brings a fleet to the south of England to claim what he believes is his kingdom from Ethelred. What follows is a series of battles between Canute and Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, which culminated at the Battle of Ashington. A chronicler at the time mentioned the whole English nation fought for Edmund, noting Mercians, West Saxons and East Angles among the ranks. It's quite telling that the Northumbrians had been left out, although I believe they acknowledged Canute as king from the start, so it's no surprise really. Edmund Ironside fled to Gloucestershire, with Canute in hot pursuit. There was possibly one more battle around the area of the Forest of Dean, but afterwards the two met to negotiate peace. The now wounded Edmund Ironside would rule the land south of the Thames, and Canute would rule the north. It was also agreed that upon either of their deaths, the other will inherit all. Funnily enough, 1 month later, Edmund dies, and Canute receives all the kingdoms of England. That's Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria. We probably won't ever know the cause of his death, but it's hard not to be suspicious. Canute inherited the Kingdom of Denmark 1 year later, in 1018, and then combined with Norway, sat at the head of a great North Sea empire. I don't know about you, but however we define the Kingdom of England now, it feels like a less solid premise than it did in Athelstan's reign. The land of the English would remain under the rule of a Scandinavian until the return of House Wessex in 1042. Edward, to be known as the Confessor, ruled until 1066, one of the most famous years in history. A year when we finally see a clear winner emerge over the tussle for what has been up till now a rather ambiguous kingdom. The Norwegians will duke it out with the Anglo-Saxons, and the winner will take on the Normans. For the purpose of this story, all you need to know is that the Norman, William the Conqueror, was the victor, and he had a kingdom to claim. And it's about time William entered the story. It was with him we began this tale, and it is he who binds the story together. Everything mentioned so far is relevant to what follows, and it does make me think William would have known a lot about what has been discussed, and maybe used it to his own advantage, in his attempt to legitimise his rule, a theme we will see plenty of. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. The coronation was conducted, partly at least in the Anglo-Saxon tongue and in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, by an Anglo-Saxon archbishop. This was also a tactic adopted by previous foreign rulers, Svein and Canute, and no one would claim they weren't kings.
The next few years would see the Normans have to put down many a rebellion. This of course included the Anglo-Scandinavians of Northumbria, who were always more than happy to challenge their southern overlords.
By 1069, a large Danish army was present in the north, possibly to secure important sites in anticipation of an invasion by King Svein II of Denmark. The Danes remained elusive, dragging King William across the country in pursuit, but never engaging in battle. The Northumbrians couldn't be trusted either. Twice William garrisoned York with Norman soldiers, and twice they were massacred once William headed back south. The Norman grip on Northumbria was weak. The conqueror could yet lose it all. William needed to address his northern problem. He won't let his York garrison be massacred a third time. The king started by sending out small contingents of soldiers to do a sweep of the countryside for rebels, putting them to the sword and destroying their hideouts.
The chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, wrote that in William's anger he commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and food of every kind should be brought together and burnt to ashes with consuming fire, so that the whole region north of the Humber might be stripped of all means of sustenance.
The aim was to ensure Northumbria couldn't hide or sustain an internal insurrection or an invading army. The consequences of what became known as the Harrying of the North is a famine and a slaughter that would see more than 100,000 people perish. Neither age or sex were spared. The Domesday Book of 1086 will give us an insight into the destruction of Yorkshire, which had been a fertile plain and now sat as a desolate waste. And waste was the word used to record places with no value or human or animal resources. In the East Riding, Barmston, Drypool, Routh and Sigglethorne are described as such. The value of Pocklington fell from £56 to £7. Bridlington reduced from £32 to just 8 shillings. Burton Agnes also suffered a similar fate, reducing from £24 to 10 shillings. Elsewhere, Burstwick and Kilnsey dropped from £56 to £10, and the coastal settlements of Withensea and Hornsey fell from £24 to 10 shillings. There seems to be an anomaly sitting amongst the charred and barren land. The Church of St. John was valued in King Edward the Confessor's time at £24 and has only reduced by around 40% to £14.
Do you remember the monster in the minster and the fallen soldier from earlier? Let's go back to that event and see what happened during the harrying.
King William's army had pitched their tents 7 miles from Beverley and began the destruction and slaughter of the local area. People fled with their valuables to the sanctuary at the Church of St. John. A group of soldiers gave chase, focusing their efforts on venerable men, sumptuously dressed, adorned with gold bracelets, who made haste to the protection of the sanctuary. The soldiers entered the town and met no resistance, and so followed their prey to the church.
Once inside, and sat high on his horse, a knight, possibly called Festinus, raised his sword high in the air and charged at those who had sought refuge inside. The knight fell off his horse, broke his neck. His head snapped backwards, and his hands and feet were said to be distorted, like a monster. Another knight became paralysed and was struck down with an incurable disease. Or so it was reported.
The fearful troops dropped their weapons and humbly besought St. John to have mercy on them. Then they headed back to William's camp to regale the terrifying and ominous story. The king believed the act to be justice from heaven, interposed to prevent a sacred edifice from being polluted with human blood. William turned this tragedy into his advantage by exercising his political and not military might. Fearing a similar revenge on the rest of his army, he sent for a meeting with the church elders.
William granted the Church of St. John all rights and liberties that previous kings had granted before him. And so he doesn't fall short on his reparations. He decorated the church with lavish gifts, and he granted them extra land for their holdings.
To finish, William likened the Church of St. John and surrounding lands to that of a magic ring amid the most appalling scenes of cruelty, devastation and blood. He moved his camp further away from the Church of St. John. The renewing of Athelstan's gift to Beverley was an astute political move, using legal precedent to cement his legitimacy as king, and what better way than exercising the same rights as previous legitimate monarchs. It's interesting to note that the renewing of Athelstan's gift in Beverley has been used by a number of monarchs who have reason to solidify their less than straightforward succession to the throne. Starting with an invading Athelstan and Duke William, Stephen of Blois and Henry Plantagenet also used Beverley as a political pawn in this way. The Normans took the vengeful act carried out by St. John as a miracle. His miracles appear in many of my stories. My favourite being an invading Scottish army was kept out of Beverley not by a massive army commanded by William de la Zouch and Lord Percy, but by St. John and around 7 bald men crying on the cobbles of the marketplace. In this story, the paralysed knight could have suffered a stroke. As far as the knight falling off the horse, I have to point out that one source describing the church as was tells of an unusual step within the entrance. But let's just go with the miracle idea, shall we? The land around Beverley, like the rest of the country, was distributed to William's loyal followers who had supported his campaign. 2 particular recipients of his generosity will also shine a light on how William exerted his control.
First up, we have Drogo de Brewer. He was a Flemish nobleman who accompanied the Duke of Normandy on his conquest. Not only was he given prime bogland in Holderness, where he built a Mott and Bailey castle here at Skipsea that some of it still stands today, but he was also given William's niece his hand in marriage.
Well, that does seem quite generous, and very normal by Norman standards. So just how did Drogo repay his king?
Well, he's suspected of poisoning his wife, and it may have been accidental. Bit tragic really, but that's William's niece. Not only that, but he claimed the lands of St John as his own, with no way of substantiating those claims. I think he's what we call a rogue, or a rumman.
The potential disaster was turned to the Crown's advantage when the Archbishop complained, using King William's own writ, in which he granted undisturbed possession of the land of St John. How could the king refuse? An opportunity to further cement his own authority. Drogo would disappear from the records, and William would grant his lands to a more trusted and loyal nobleman. The next Norman antagonist would provide William with another opportunity for a political masterclass. Walcher? Anyway, he was the Bishop of Durham and granted the governorship of Northumberland. He was said to be covetous and tyrannical. His administration was marked by cruelty, injustice and oppression. He would sanction cruel murders for personal gain, then share the profits with his co-conspirators. This is not a power or direction the Celtic-styled minster run by 7 Culdees could ever have achieved. To secure the bishop's fidelity to the crown, William granted him land in the county of York. It took no time at all for this maniacal bishop to use violence to seize property that came within his reach, including Welton, then owned by the Canons of Beverley. In their complaint, the Canons claimed the land as the gift of King William and of his confirmation. This is the type of legitimacy to rule that he has worked his whole life for, and a fine example of how he used Athelstan's gift to help cement his place on the throne of a cobbled-together kingdom with many claimants to its crown. Despite his cruelty, he was remembered as the Conqueror, and from being the Tanner's grandson to the King of England, a whole lifetime of fighting for legitimacy in one way or another, the name does seem apt.
Well, there you go, that's the story, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe and check out my other videos as well. There's some absolute belters on there. I'll put a few up on the screen in a moment, but that's it for me. I'm out, so until next time.